Have you heard about the controversial yoga alignment debate about twisting and what we should do with our pelvis when we're twisting in yoga? So, sometimes we'll hear that it's really important that we hold our pelvis square as we twist. And then sometimes, kind of on the other side of this debate, we'll hear that we should twist and allow the pelvis to turn along with the twist. So that's ultimately what the debate is. Do we hold the pelvis square or do we allow it to turn as we twist in our yoga poses? Now, here are a couple of just like asana examples to show you what I'm talking about here. But twisting triangle, Parivrtta Trikonasana, is kind of a common pose where this comes up, where sometimes we'll be in yoga class and the teacher will say, make sure that your pelvis stays like square or level and hold it that way as you twist. So this is one way of approaching twisting triangle. But then we also sometimes have yoga teachers say that it's really important that it's not that the pelvis is square, but instead we let the pelvis turn and we twist our spine. So something a little more like that. So that's the distinction, squared or turned pelvis. And then another asana example where I see this comes up quite a bit is twisting chair pose. So in twisting chair, we tend to rotate, we tend to hook our elbow across the opposite knee. And then what I experience in yoga class is that there are kind of two camps. And on one side, yoga teachers will tell the students to look down at their knees. So look down at your knees in the twist and make sure that your knees are flush. So the idea is that the knees are side by side, like in a horizontal plane as we twist. And the idea with that is the knees here are kind of a proxy for what the pelvis is doing, because wherever the pelvis goes, the knees will go too. So if we're looking down and keeping the knees flush, what that basically is asking the pelvis to hold square again. So that's kind of what that cue is about. Because sometimes if we're not thinking about it in twisting chair, this outer knee just kind of slides forward. And maybe I'm exaggerating it a little bit here, but just to give the example, that outer knee sometimes slides forward. So sometimes we're supposed to look down, pull the knee back, and keep them flush. But then we might have teachers on the other side of the debate who won't give that cue. And if anything, they may even suggest that you let the knees slide forward a little bit. And again, that would be in order to consciously turn the pelvis, rotate the pelvis as you're twisting. So one final asana example that I wanted to share is a seated twist. I personally find that this comes up a lot when we're in our seated poses. So let's just take the kind of classic seated twist, Marichyasana C. So once again, sometimes we'll have yoga teachers who will want the pelvis to stay square, like pointed straight forward, aligned with the front of the mat, and then we twist from there. But then sometimes we'll have teachers on the other side of the debate who will ask us to go out of our way to scoot this outer, like whole leg forward, which will pull the hip with it and therefore the pelvis. And now the pelvis is rotated and then we twist from there. So in this example, the pelvis has rotated with the spine. So those are three asana examples, just so we have some concrete idea of like how this is applied in our yoga practice. And now let's take a look at the biomechanics involved so that we can really examine what's up with this debate about the pelvis being square or the pelvis turning and get a sense so that we can decide for ourselves which one, square or not square, would we like to practice in our own yoga practice or teach if we're yoga teachers. So I'd like to start out by focusing on the side of the debate that tells us that when we twist, it's really important that we turn the pelvis along with the spine. So let's look at that side of the argument first. And in my experience, the main reason that we tend to be taught that is due to beliefs around safety and around injury prevention. And and this is again my experience, but I've been taught this in multiple yoga teacher trainings that the main concern here has to do with keeping the sacroiliac joint safe. So the sacroiliac joint is the joints where our sacrum, which is the base, like the bottom bone of the spine, where the sacrum articulates with the pelvis, and where where those bones come together, that's the sacroiliac joint. So the belief is that if we hold the pelvis square and we don't let it move, and then if we twist our spine, that spinal rotation will layer its way all the way down to the sacrum because the sacrum is part of the spine structurally. And that will result in the sacrum being rotated or twisted in the SI joints. And that is supposedly a bad thing. That's supposedly something that we hear in yoga teacher trainings. This is what we're taught. It's supposedly something that can destabilize the SI joint and injure us and cause us pain. So that's what I've been taught multiple times. That's my experience of the main reason we're supposed to let the pelvis turn, because the idea is if the pelvis turns as we twist, then we keep the sacrum and the pelvis like kind of in line together or like flush together. It all moves as one unit. This is the idea. And it prevents that like twisting happening at the SI joint. So that's what we tend to be taught. But again, that's what we tend to be taught within yoga teacher trainings and like the yoga lineages and yoga rules that have been handed down to us. But if we actually look to actual scientific resources and what movement science and biomechanics tells us about this area of the body, there's actually tons of research that's been done on this region. And it's been definitively established that the SI joints, the sacroiliac joints, are some of the strongest and most stable joints of the whole body. And in fact, they're like built for stability. And even in the bony structure, like the way that the bone of the sacrum articulates with the bone of the ilium or the pelvic bone, there are all these interlocking ridges in between the bones that a skeletal level just interlocks them so that there's very little movement available there. And it's not an easy place to actually pull out of place and destabilize. In addition to the bony structure, there are also super strong ligaments that cross the joints and reinforce the joints. And some of the ligaments of the SI joint are some of the strongest ligaments in the whole human body. So, actually, if you consult research on the SI joint, what we learn is that there's very little movement that can happen there. Some sources state that it's something like 2 to 4 millimeters, which is such a small amount of movement. Other sources state that there is zero movement available at all. So, all of that is just to really reinforce this idea that this region of the body is actually very stable. And it's not vulnerable to being pulled out of place or destabilized or damaged. It's not vulnerable to that from something like a low load, slow, controlled yoga practice. And it's definitely not something that can be pulled out of place if we hold the pelvis square versus letting the pelvis turn just a little bit. Like, do you see the difference? It's like this to this. So it's a matter of a few degrees of movement with like very low load, low forces involved. The idea in yoga is that like that super small difference in alignment is going to drastically pull the sacrum out of alignment and cause all this pain. And that's just not biologically plausible, and it's not research supported. In fact, what we really know about this area of the body is that for there to truly be actual damage here, like structural tissue damage, that is most often the result of like serious trauma or like a high impact incident, something like a car accident or a high impact collision in a sporting event, something like that. Those are contexts in which maybe this area of the body could be injured or destabilized. But a low load, slow body weight practice, a mindful practice like yoga, this area of the body is not inherently vulnerable to injury in yoga. So there's actually, I would just like to bring our awareness to the fact that within like evidence-based clinical and research circles, people who actually study like pain and injury and this region of the body, there is a call among these evidence-based researchers for people to stop using these outdated fear-based narratives around the SI joint. And I think this is a really important message to bring to the yoga world as well, because the idea is if we spread this idea like to our yoga students or within the yoga community, if we spread the idea that the SI joints are fragile and vulnerable to something like whether the pelvis is here or here in a twist, that can really potentially contribute to like beliefs about our bodies in which we believe that we're just really vulnerable to just like the smallest little like quote misalignments and movements. And that's just really not the case. And that's not the kind of like mentality and beliefs around our bodies that we want to be breeding or suggesting for people. Instead, we want to show our students how resilient their bodies are and be much more like optimistic about the body. So, I definitely just wanna make sure that I emphasize, 'cause I have a feeling people might hear what I just said and be like, "That's like, I do have pain here, so, like, what are you talking about?" And, like, people might wanna push back because of that. So I just wanna make sure I emphasize that it is definitely common for people to have sensitivity around this region. That's definitely a common area where people do experience pain. But and I could go on a whole rabbit hole right now, I'm not going to, but, to actually learn more about the science of pain, if we actually study that, we start to realize that pain is an output of the brain, that our brain is a predictive processor, and that pain is a biopsychosocial phenomenon that isn't tied down directly and on a one-to-one basis with something like tissue damage. There's so much more that can influence an experience of pain than just tissue damage. So there may be many other reasons and any combination of reasons that we feel sensitivity around the SI joint region, but it's not likely that one of those reasons is that we pulled our SI joint out of alignment in a yoga twist or even in a yoga practice in general. So, to summarize all of that, I would just like to suggest that there's no need to go out of our way to ask yoga students to specifically turn the pelvis along with the spine when they twist, if our reason is safety and protection. There's no reason to do that. We don't need to do that. There may be other reasons that we might like to suggest people let the pelvis turn, but those wouldn't be about pain and injury. And I'm gonna talk about those, but I just wanted to make sure that I got this like pain, injury conversation out of the way first. All right. So we've established that we don't need to worry about our pelvic alignment in twists when it comes to injury and safety. But that doesn't mean that what our pelvis is doing in twists like doesn't matter at all and we should never care about that or never pay attention to that. So that's what I wanted to turn our attention to now. Like, there are some good reasons to consciously choose to maybe hold the pelvis square as we twist. And there are other good reasons to consciously let the pelvis turn with the twist, and it really just comes down to the biomechanical effects that each variation might have on the body. And once we understand those a bit more, we can be more intentional about like which alignment we may choose for ourselves in our own yoga practice or like for our classes if we're teaching. So, one factor that I like to point out when it comes to this is if we hold our pelvis stable, like if we hold it square and then we twist without letting the pelvis move, that means that our twist is like the movement involved in this twist is mostly happening in the spine and not much else is moving. So it's kind of a more like spinal isolated asana that way. But if we let the pelvis turn, I'm gonna reorient myself here so you might be able to see this a little more clearly. If we, and let's do the twisting triangle example here, if we actually let the pelvis turn and then we twist, we've not only allowed the spine to rotate, but we've also brought in hip movement. So because the pelvis has rotated here, that means that this front hip in my twisting triangle, my front leg's hip, has actually come into a position of hip adduction because the pelvis has turned, and adduction, hip adduction, is when the leg crosses the midline. So if you can kind of see it from this, like from this angle, if my pelvis has rotated here as I turn, then I'm coming into hip adduction in this front leg. Now, just to be super technical about it, adduction is this direction of movement, but technically, because we're in hip flexion, like roughly 90-ish degrees, this is technically horizontal hip adduction. Just if we want to be really technical about it, that's where the hip is first flexed to 90 and then it crosses midline. But regardless, we can kind of casually just say adduction. And why might that matter? Well, this might matter, letting the pelvis turn and getting this hip movement in the front hip. That might matter if like we're interested in mobilizing that front hip in that direction of adduction. So when the leg crosses midline like that, that will put the tissues that run along the lateral hip and the lateral thigh, it puts them on a stretch. So we actually stretch and target those tissues that way. And specifically in twisting triangle, because this front knee is pretty straight. This should also, if we let the pelvis turn, it should also bring in like some IT band stretch as well, because the IT band crosses that knee. So when the knee is straight, and then we cross midline, that brings on more of like the full IT band and outer hip. So, if that's an intention, if that's something that we're interested in doing, then we should know that by letting the pelvis turn, we will be mobilizing that front hip. We've kind of brought that into the equation. However, if we have an intention, maybe we're not interested in hip mobilization in that moment. Maybe we have an interest in isolating our spinal movement. And some reasons that we might care about that are like I believe there's inherent value in just knowing how to differentiate when our spine is moving versus like when our pelvis is moving, just so that we consciously like have that distinction. And like, if we haven't focused on that before, then really attempting to kind of isolate spinal movement without letting the pelvis also move, that could be just some nice novel movement input in that could feed into our nervous system and potentially give us more movement options in the bigger picture. So that's one reason why, just in general, doing any sort of like isolated joint movement, like say shoulder circles, trying not to move any other part of my body, and I'm just trying to move the shoulder. Those are one of the benefits of like isolated joint movements like that. It doesn't mean that this is like better, isolating is better than not isolating. It's all just about like what's your goal in the moment. So yeah, so I think I like to think about holding the pelvis square and then twisting. That way is more about isolation in terms of isolating spinal movement. Letting the pelvis turn as we twist is more of an integrated movement that involves more of the kinetic chain. And then we could think about specifically like maybe that hip being mobilized a little bit more. Now, another factor that I like to consider when it comes to kind of thinking about like isolation versus integration is just like what that might mean for our yoga pose in general and like what our goal is. So let's for example take the example of twisting chair pose, which we've talked about a little bit today here. So twisting chair, Utkatasana, we rotate, and often the idea is that you want to get your elbow to cross the opposite knee, and we may have different reasons for actually wanting to get that elbow hook. I know sometimes we might teach like where we specifically don't want to hook the elbow for maybe some more core engagement. So there could be that reason. But in general, my experience is more often the case, we're interested in actually hooking the elbow for whatever reason. In my classes, a transition that I often like to teach is twisting chair pose and then step a foot back. And I personally find that stepping back movement becomes like more accessible and more in the flow if we actually have the hook, because then more of my body is kind of connected into one connected unit and that can help with stability, because it's definitely a balance challenge to step a foot back. So for me, that may be one reason why I might like to hook the elbow if that's what I'm leading twist and share into. So anyway, it's important to think about, or I think it's helpful to think about range of motion. And when it comes to isolated versus integrated movement, if we invite our students to come in a twisting chair, but if we insist on the flush knees that I talked about in the beginning, which means that the hips stay square, that actually means that we'll have less room to turn in general. Because if you think about it, say you were just standing, just like a standing twist, If I want to hold my pelvis square and just rotate my spine, I can rotate however far I can rotate and say, like, my eyes look at a spot on the wall and I see a certain spot on the wall. If instead of holding the pelvis still and rotating, if instead I turn my spine and just let the pelvis come along and let the whole kind of kinetic chain be involved there, then I rotate globally, I rotate further, and my eyes end up looking at a spot further back, like I have, in a whole body sense, I've turned further. In just my spine, I haven't rotated further, but because I involve more parts, I could collectively rotate further. So that may be a consideration in something like twisting chair. Because, like I said, if we insist on the squared pelvis, but we also want the elbow to hook, we may be holding some people back because keeping the pelvis square doesn't let you turn as far on a global level. But if instead we just forget about cueing those flush knees because it's not really important when it comes to injury, blah, 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 then we just say, like, rotate, see if you can get the elbow to hook. And then for most people, if they're not thinking about it, that outer knee will slide forward. Again, an indication it's showing you that the pelvis has turned. But by allowing that, we allow more global movement and it will tend to make getting that elbow hook just more accessible for many people at least. So my suggestion would be, like, if getting that bind or in any version of a twist, if you have a goal like that, like reaching some sort of body part to another, maybe we can not worry so much about, like, layering on these rules of, like, these keep those knees flush, don't let the pelvis turn. If our goal is just for more global movement to happen so that we can find some sort of form that we're looking for. Another factor I'd like to address is range of motion and, like, which version of pelvic alignment would help us find, quote, the deepest twist, like the deepest spinal twist. So, like, what if that's your intention for the moment? What if what you really want to do is come into the, quote, deepest twist possible? Then which one would we want to choose? And in my opinion, it doesn't really matter. I don't think squared pelvis versus turned pelvis will make a difference for whether you mobilize your spine more or less into rotation. And that's because, let's look at Marichasana C, so our seated twist example. That's because I think you can find your end range spinal rotation in either variation. So let's say I'm going to do the squared hip variation here. So pelvis is square and then I turn. So I just rotate until I find, my edge and I hang out there. I'm in my end range spinal rotation. Now, if I were to do the thing where I scoot like this hip forward and I turn the pelvis a little so that my pelvis turns with a twist, then I'll turn. And once again, it does mean that globally I turn a little further. Like I talked about a few minutes ago, in the first twist, I might have had my eyes able to reach one spot on the wall. And if I let the pelvis turn, I can probably find a further back spot. But that's just due to global movement. It doesn't necessarily mean that I turned the spine itself any deeper. So basically, I just kind of come into the same end range spinal position here, but I just also had the pelvis turned. So globally, I'm turned a little bit more, but I'm still at my end range of spinal rotation. So I think in either variation, you can get to your spinal end range or spinal rotation end range. So if mobilizing the spine into rotation and therefore finding your end range and hanging out there for a bit, if that's a goal, I don't think the pelvic alignment really matters because you can find end range in either one of them. So, circling back to our original question here, which was, should we keep our pelvis square when we twist in yoga, or should we let the pelvis turn when we twist in yoga? I hope that I've made the case here for the fact that this is really a much more nuanced conversation than just like simple black and white ideas about this way is right and this way is wrong. And once again, I would just suggest that if we're concerned about injury and safety, I would suggest that it really does not matter if we hold the pelvis still or if we let the pelvis turn when we twist. If our bodies, if our SI joints, if our spines were really that fragile that just a matter of a few degrees of pelvis movement in a twist, where if that were like a primary factor in whether or not we get injured, I actually think we'd have a lot more that we need to worry about in terms of safety and injury. Like just on a day-to-day basis, all day long, we need to worry about protecting our body all the time if a simple pelvic adjustment in a yoga twist really was an injury factor. So anyway, just bringing a little perspective to that. However, there are other biomechanical considerations that we may want to think about in terms of the pelvis in twists, and we covered them in this video. So, if I were to sum up my personal approach to the pelvis and twists, I'd say on the whole, I typically tend to not micromanage pelvic alignment and twists unless I have a specific reason. Like in that moment or in that class, I might have a particular theme where actually controlling the pelvis and paying attention to it in a twist would make a difference. If I had an intention in the moment, then I might cue around pelvic alignment in a twist, and sometimes I do. But on the whole, I typically allow my students' bodies to self-organize, and I try not to micromanage too much. So, with all of that said, this is what I believe is an evidence-based approach to the pelvis and twists. If you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the content that I share.